It is December the 29th, 1916, and on a dark night in a palace in Russia, a small group of conspirators are anxiously awaiting their date with destiny. For on the way to join them right now is an imposing, mysterious figure, one who to them may as well be the devil himself, Grigori Rasputin. Their task is simple. Tonight, Rasputin must be assassinated. But why? Though known today as a womanizer and the subject of a famous Boney M song, during his life Rasputin was a huge object of fear and hatred for many powerful people inside Russia. He may not have had an affair with the Russian Empress like is often said, but this mysterious and dishevelled preacher with mystical healing powers nevertheless worked his way up to being a huge influence on the royal family. When the First World War tipped their government into chaos, Rasputin became the target for blame. To get rid of him could maybe save Russia, or perhaps it was already too late. The assassination of him that night has since entered into legend, in no small part due to the exaggerated retellings from some of the conspirators themselves years later. But how much of it is truth versus fiction, and how much do we actually know about Rasputin and his assassination amidst all of the noise and tales that continue to define his historical legacy? Today we look at the assassination of Grigori Rasputin, a story of unmatched drama and unparalleled exaggeration. How did Grigori Rasputin go from being a poor and wandering mystic to a close associate of the Tsar and a legend of Russian folklore? Born in remote Siberia in 1869, it would seem he was destined for a drab and quiet life. The first step on the ladder to immortalised notoriety came in 1897, when the 28-year-old Rasputin had a religious awakening. Becoming a wandering holy man, his charisma began to draw followers, whilst whispers began in earnest of his supposed healing powers. In 1903, his wanderings took him all the way to the Russian capital of St. Petersburg, and through religious connections was introduced to Archbishop Theophan, a prominent figure in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Through Theophan, Rasputin was soon rubbing shoulders with St. Petersburg's high society, who at that time were becoming gripped with an interest in mysticism. In other words, Rasputin's arrival could not have come at a better time. In November 1905, he reached the top of the social ladder when he was introduced to the Russian royal family. His influence quickly started to grow on the Russian Empress Alexandra, but even more so on the royal couple's son, Alexei. Alexei's position in the family was a rather unique one. He was the only son and therefore the heir to the throne, but was also a stricken and sickly boy suffering from haemophilia, a rare blood disease. His constant pain was matched by the feeling of anxiety around him from both family and doctors, and the superstitious Alexandra, having heard of Rasputin's healing powers, hired him to help her son. He was hardly the first candidate you'd expect to be chosen to tend to the ailments of a royal child, but to everyone's amazement, Alexei actually seemed to respond to Rasputin's apparent powers. On one occasion, the preacher even managed to help the boy recover when he was on the brink of death. Could it really have been magic? Unsurprisingly, no. What did happen, however, was that Rasputin lessened the contact that Alexei had with his doctors, which meant he received less of the painkiller aspirin. Unbeknownst to medical professionals at the time, aspirin also acts as a blood thinner, and therefore simply made the boy's pain worse. Rasputin also may have used hypnosis on Alexei to calm him down, lessening both his anxiety and that of his family in a kind of placebo effect. Magic or not, to an extent the arrangement seemed to be working, but as his name became more and more known within Russia, rumours about the man started to grow. For as we know today, there was much more to Rasputin than the facade of a mysterious holy man. His nickname of the Mad Monk gives the first clue, a nickname that is actually pretty ironic as he was never even a monk and didn't hold any position within the Russian Orthodox Church. But beyond that, there were two loves that defined him the most: women and alcohol. His womanizing especially has become a large part of how he's remembered, and although the legends of this are somewhat exaggerated, he nevertheless had regular affairs with women ranging from street prostitutes to ladies of high society. He even had affairs with his female followers, bizarrely claiming that he could absolve them of their sin through sinful actions followed by repentance. Having portrayed himself as a spiritual and devout religious man in the presence of the royal family, it wasn't long before those close to the family started to see through it. Even the Tsar soon began to hear whispers of Rasputin's behaviour, but simply chose to bury his head in the sand. To send Rasputin away was to make the Tsar the murderer of his own son, and sound the death knell of the Russian monarchy for good. Rasputin had to stay. But if Rasputin's influence over the royal family was causing enough worry during peacetime, the dawning of the First World War would bring this to a whole new level. As Europe became engulfed by the flames of conflict, with Rasputin's help, the last shred of dignity that the Russian monarchy was still clinging on to was about to burn with it. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand looked set to drag Europe into an apocalyptic war. In Russia, Rasputin desperately urged the Tsar not to proceed, warning that this would be a catastrophe upon the empire. Just 9 years earlier, the Russian army had been given a humiliating boot up the backside from Japan, a humiliation that the monarchy had only just survived. But naive as ever, the Tsar had clearly not learned his lesson, and believed that this new war could actually be a way to unite his citizens. He was playing with fire over a deeply unhappy country, but once the war began, there was no turning back. Ironically though, it would be Rasputin that would benefit from the very war he had tried to prevent. To the surprise of almost nobody, the war quickly started going badly, so in 1915 the Tsar threw everything into one last desperate gamble by going to the front and taking charge of the army himself. The autocrat of an autocratic country was now out of the picture, so the job of ruling Russia fell to his wife, and one of her closest advisors was, of course, Rasputin. In truth, Alexandra was up against it from the start. The fact she herself was German hardly helped win the public over, as rumours of her being a traitor began to spread on the streets of St. Petersburg. And now stood beside her was a sex-crazed, alcoholic preacher who had seemingly just stumbled into the corridors of power and now found himself near the top, driving the credibility of the monarchy even further into the mud. To some extent, Rasputin was used as a scapegoat by a society infuriated both on the front and at home. That being said, he did still hold significant power despite having virtually no knowledge of politics, and frequently advised Alexandra on the appointment of ministers. Unsurprisingly, these ministers usually turned out to be either self-serving or incompetent. Governance in Russia was quickly becoming a joke. After being stung by Japan just 10 years earlier, the Tsar had been forced to make political concessions, including the setting up of the State Duma, a new elected parliament that, although completely subservient to the Tsar, represented some form of progress. Now it looked like the country had regressed back to square one, and the dysfunction began to fan the flames of revolution once more. Accordingly, Rasputin's number of enemies started to grow, along with a bloodthirst for violence against him. Rumours of an affair between him and Alexandra, whilst almost certainly not true, only intensified this. Disgusted at the state their empire was now in, a group of nobles took matters into their own hands to rescue Russia's dignity and save it from a total collapse. Rasputin had to die. By the end of 1916, the Russian Empire was on the brink of complete disaster. As the main scapegoat for the whole mess, Rasputin was the one who found himself in the crosshairs, and not for the first time either. Back in 1914, before the start of the war, Rasputin had been the victim of an assassination attempt whilst visiting his home village in Siberia. In this incident, a deranged woman named Kyonya Guseva had stabbed Rasputin in the stomach, believing he was the Antichrist. Despite being seriously wounded, Rasputin recovered in just a few weeks. How would anyone manage to take down this near mythical man? Fast forward to 1916, and in the chambers of the State Duma, the wheels of a new assassination plot, one now etched in history forever, were beginning to turn. On November 19th, 1916, a politician named Vladimir Purishkevich delivered a speech decrying the chaos that Russia had fallen into under the governance of Alexandra and Rasputin. His ominous intentions were clear, declaring, "Whilst Rasputin is alive, we cannot win." The fiery speech caught the attention of a prince named Felix Yusupov, a relative of the Tsar. They quickly began to correspond and soon got in contact with another of the Tsar's relatives, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. Sensing that removing Rasputin from the picture was the only way to save the regime, these three powerful men began working together to concoct a plan that would take down the mad monk for good. How would they do it? Simple. They would use his notorious womanizing against him. Accordingly, Yusupov laid the trap by inviting Rasputin to a party at his palace with the promise that his beautiful wife Irina would be in attendance. Whether it was really this that coaxed Rasputin to the party, or if he was drawn by the opportunity to meet with other powerful people in the regime, no one will ever know for sure, but the mad monk nevertheless accepted. Even before attending this party, in the final weeks of 1916, Rasputin was seemingly beginning to sense that his time was near. In a letter to Alexandra, he wrote, "I feel that I should leave life before January the 1st. A minister loyal to Rasputin actually warned him not to attend the party, to which Rasputin allegedly replied that it was too late." And this is what brings us to the fabulously dramatic and endlessly retold tale of December the 29th, 1916. It goes a little something like this. That evening, Yusupov was driven to pick up Rasputin and take him back to the Moika Palace. As they proceeded through the dark and icy streets, the other conspirators were busy in the palace basement loading up cakes and expensive wine with massive amounts of cyanide. Rasputin supposedly devoured these without any trouble at all, as he continually demanded to meet Irina. A panicked Yusupov then decided he could take no more chances and rushed upstairs to consult with the others, grab his pistol, and fire a single shot into Rasputin's chest. The legend continues that the seemingly dead preacher suddenly opened his demonic eyes and sprung up to attack the prince, before trying to escape through the courtyard where two more bullets from Purishkevich would cut him down once again. His body was then thrown in a frozen river and found days later with his arms raised against the ice, suggesting that even after all this punishment, it had taken drowning in the river to finally finish him off. It's no wonder that this intense and dramatic retelling of his assassination has remained so popular, but unfortunately, that does not necessarily mean it's accurate. This account comes from Yusupov himself more than a decade afterwards, by which point he and Irina were living in exile in Paris. When this retelling began to circulate, Rasputin's daughter Maria ridiculed the prince's story, in particular claiming that the poison cakes aspect was a lie, as her father was known to avoid sweet foods. Rasputin's autopsy also found no signs of either poison or drowning, poking some pretty cavernous holes in Yusupov's story. An earlier account by Purishkevich also lacks some of these dramatic details told by Yusupov. Purishkevich, however, did corroborate the idea that Rasputin attempted to escape after the first bullet wound. He was then shot in the courtyard before one more bullet to the head finally ended his life. This bullet was highlighted in the autopsy as the moment that likely killed him. Perhaps Yusupov was trying to shape this story into an epic tale of good and evil, of patriots slaying an inhuman beast to rescue their country from oblivion. On the other hand, maybe he was just trying to cover his own back at what a panicked and ineffective assassin he'd been. Either way, Rasputin was dead. The sudden and brutal death of Grigori Rasputin brought grief to the royal household. Alexandra was particularly distraught, having lost both her closest advisor and her son's healer. As Russia entered the new year of 1917, the conspirators were hoping, praying, that maybe their act had pulled Russia back from the brink. There was going to be change all right, but not in the way they expected. For even with Rasputin gone, the incompetence of the Tsarist government did not magically vanish as they had hoped. The monarchy's problems went far deeper than just Rasputin, and it had been that way for a long time. In fact, as rumours started to swirl regarding the nature of Rasputin's death, Some came to see it as a cynical attempt by rich noblemen to cling on to power, which is essentially exactly what it was. With the civilians and military continuing to be battered by the war, this act hardly helped resurrect any loyalty. Less than 3 months after the assassination, the futility of their attempts became clear when the February Revolution broke out in St. Petersburg. The Tsar quickly abdicated, and 300 years of rule by the Romanovs came to an end. The regime was replaced by a provisional government, but their continued support for the war put them on borrowed time, and by November 1917 a second revolution overthrew them. In their place, the communist Vladimir Lenin and his party, the Bolsheviks, came to power. In July 1918, the entire royal family and several of their servants were murdered by the Bolsheviks in the city of Yekaterinburg, possibly on Lenin's orders. Meanwhile, the 3 main conspirators went their separate ways, having failed miserably in their desperate and deluded quest to save the regime. Purishkevich died in 1920, whilst Yusupov and Pavlovich spent the rest of their lives in exile. The account Yusupov gave of the assassination in 1928 has since come to shape almost everything that is widely known about Rasputin in the present day. Indeed, it is this story that captures the exaggerated lens with which Rasputin was viewed at the time, not only a sleazy opportunist, but a dark and mystical force casting his spell as the puppet master over all of Russia. Whilst historical evidence shows that Yusupov's story should be taken with a grain of salt to say the least, it has nevertheless helped fuel a broad fascination with Rasputin ever since, making it hard to separate the fact from the fiction. The provisional government's leader, Alexander Kerensky, said himself that without Rasputin, there would be no Lenin. Whilst this is pretty inaccurate, or at the very least a massive exaggeration, almost 110 years later, Rasputin's life and influence is still just as mythologized as it always was, and the legacy that he left behind continues to burn on. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.